Rock Book Show. I'm Kimberly Austin, and joining me today is Steve Miller from Detroit, or, well, kind of near Detroit.
Right.
But Steve is the conduit, which he will explain, for this great book, Detroit Rock City, The Uncensored History of Rock and Roll in America's Loudest City. Well, first of all, Steve, you make the case that Detroit is the most influential rock and roll city in America. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, that's exactly what I went into this thinking, I've always believed it. I mean, influential in terms of the sonics and the music that people, so many musicians, I think, have embraced the Detroit sound, and they use it sometimes knowingly or not, in the way they approach music. And over the years, I would travel, I'd live in different places, and I'd go to see bands. And I'd say, wow, I don't even know if they know that they took that lick or they took that approach out of Detroit. So sometimes I don't know that it's an awareness that everybody has, but about the wide-reaching influences of Detroit music. Going back to starting with about the Stooges and the MC5, which I think are two of the most influential bands ever.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, how you came to write this book kind of sounds like the beginning of an old joke. A guy walks into a bar in Detroit.
Yeah. Well, it is true. Well, and there's a backstory to that too. For space considerations, I'd always wanted to read this book. It was something that I don't know. I just always wanted to read. So I figured, well, someday somebody will write this. And time passed, and we're talking the late '90s. I'd started thinking about this, and time passed, and nobody wrote it. And I kept thinking about it, and then I was literally in a bar, and a friend of mine was visiting. I was living in D.C. at the time. I was visiting home, and somebody came up to me and said, "Well, you're a writer, right?" I'm like, "Oh, yeah. How'd you know?" And he said, "How come nobody's ever written a book about Detroit music, rock and roll?" I said, I don't know, but I can't wait." And so the years passed, and the opportunity presented itself, and I was very fortunate. And I found myself in a position to do it.
Yeah, I've interviewed other conduits, if you will, who put together oral histories.
Yeah.
So explain how you go about putting that together and finding who you want to speak to. And
That's a great question. I had a what I called the master list of, I just, and I'd make it over a period of weeks. I'd say, well, if you could do something like this, who would you talk to? And I just kept putting down names, knowing full well I wasn't going to get everybody, just because otherwise I'd be one of those guys that works on a book for 10 years, which I just don't have much interest in doing. My attention span isn't that great, and so I just put together this list, and it was very comprehensive. And then once I got the go, and I got we got a deal, I just went on that list and went right down it. Actually, starting with the older folks first, because I figured they'd be the first to go. If in the process somebody passed away, unfortunately, at least I'd have them on record and so on.
yeah, I like the way you divided the book up into this timeline. So it's 65 to 72, 73 to 81, and 81 to 2000. Did that break in that timeline come naturally? Did you start to see it?
Yeah, it did. It came real naturally. In fact, that 65 through 72, you knew the 72 was even in the book, as it says, it talks about the end of this era. And it's significant. Each era had this end, and I thought it worked in a weird natural form where I didn't, it was odd. I don't know why. It just happened. I didn't plan it that way, but people actually started talking about these ends of eras. And I was around for the end of that era, 80, 73, 80. So I was there, and I knew what was going on in terms of a new breed coming in, the younger people that were really pissing off the older people who thought they were the younger people. They were all, ahead of the game with the new wave and punk that came in the late 70s.
Did you feel like there was one significant event from each era? Could you pinpoint that at all?
One in terms of
or an artist that really?
Well, I think there were. In a way, defining artists that defined each era. Obviously, I think the White Stripes defined that latter era of Detroit. The middle is notable because there wasn't anybody that defined it, and that was very odd. And of course, in the beginning, it would be that was the Stooges and the MC5, but you also had Alice Cooper and so on, and others, the Grand Funk Railroad, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I actually got a chance to talk with Dick Wagner with his book that was out recently.
Yeah.
Wow, his book is amazing, and to revisit that era of Detroit music, which I was too young for, it just
Yeah.
sounds like the most magical music time. And the
Right.
Grandy Ballroom, I just wish I could have seen.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people, I mean, I think, it's funny because you tend to romanticize these old venues and times and the scenes. But I think of all these, the Grandy really does sound magical, I guess because it's new and it's, just any more than the 100 Club in England, would have been in 76. These were really vibrant, new, everybody's excited. It keeps them happy that way.
Yeah. Do you think Cream magazine influenced how the rest of America looked at Detroit magazine, and did they influence it appropriately?
Yeah, I think Cream was just this great beacon for Detroit. I mean, it's just tremendous, tremendously influential in terms of course, in terms of magazines. I mean, so many other publications have cited Cream as an influence. But yeah, I think Cream represented Detroit really, really well. I mean, it was national in scope, of course, and international for that matter. But you never got away reading it. I mean, I can look over here. There's a big stack of Creams. Um, you could never get away from its Detroitness, when you read it. And because it was, I mean, they were in both attitude and then actually in geography, because you can see that they talk about being in Detroit and so on. It was a great place for a magazine. It's a great magazine.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things I really loved about your book is I didn't know about some of the friendships that were between some of the Detroit musicians that were unexpected, like Iggy Pop and Glenn Frey.
Right, yeah. And who would know? I mean, but at that time, of course, it was not a big deal. No, I mean, Glenn Frey wasn't in the Eagles, and so nobody really knew, who was going to go on to where. But I thought that was really, really cool. I think it was somebody had told about taking their first acid experience with Glenn Frey, in fact, in Ann Arbor. I thought that was kind of cool.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Was there one story in particular that stuck out to you as you were compiling the book that you thought, man, I never knew that, and I never would have known it otherwise?
A ton, just a ton, because again, I'm just really just the guy who's sitting there, having a conversation. So I mean, there were, I love the story about the one that I got early on was from a promoter called named Michael Quattro, and he talked about how dealing with Terry Knight to get Grand Funk. Terry Knight was Grand Funk's manager, and he tried to get them in a bill. Michael Quattro was from Detroit, but he promoted all over the Midwest, trying to get Grand Funk on a bill in Cincinnati on a Joe Cocker bill. And this is, I think, maybe late '69, and he couldn't do it. And Terry Knight was really angry. And so the following summer, Michael Quattro called Terry Knight. Michael Quattro's putting on the Cincinnati Pop Festival. And he says, I really want Grand Funk." Now, by now, Grand Funk was really big. And Terry Knight says, "Well, listen, Grand Funk is now getting $10,000 a crack." And, Quattro's like, "Well, okay, I'll take them for $10,000. And Terry Knight says, "But for you, because you blew me off and you didn't get them on that bill in Cincinnati last year, it's 20,000." And I thought, wow, that's hardball, man. And Quattro says, "Of course I paid it."
Exactly.
But those kinds of stories I love, and that's a business story,
Yeah.
but there's all kinds of tales in there about that are not business.
No, and I like the story in there too, but the guy who worked at the post office.
Yeah, you mean getting the postcards?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and later on he'd read them. He'd check them out. He'd go, "Wow, this is really cool." He was really excited. In fact, he went on to become a promoter. That guy was, just a kid working in the local post office. And he'd see these beautiful Grandy postcards that would go out to, that Russ Gibb was, for the shows, the little handbills, and he'd think, "Wow, this is something else. These are so cool." And I thought that was cool because later on he went on to become a pretty big promoter himself.
Is there one band that you just to this day cannot believe they didn't make it?
Hmm. Well, you could say the Stooges, because remember, when they broke up, I remember buying the first Stooges album as a cutout. What was a cutout back then? You'd cut off the corner, and they were going on sale. They'd half price them, and you'd go to a store and you'd say, "Oh, these are the things that we couldn't get rid of." And and so, well, so the Stooges were never big until, well, I guess until they were honored by the Brits, primarily in the mid to late '70s as forerunners of the punk rock scene. But no, there wasn't anybody. I mean, when I say make it, really making it means you made some good music. I don't think making it means you made a bunch of money. Um, I was surprised at the SRC. I'd never really been that familiar with SRC, and got turned on to that music, and I really thought that was really good. But again, could they have made it? I don't know. There's a whole lot of things that come together to make it. There's another part in that book that I loved. It really crystallized it for me, and it was talking with someone from the Silver Bullet Band, Bob Seger's band, and he talked about they were on tour and they went down. They had breakfast one morning at the hotel with one of the guys from Bachman Turner Overdrive, and he kind of told how it worked for in the business to make it, and you'd have to have the perfect music, the perfect manager, and the perfect time. I thought, wow, that explains some things to me too. But again, I don't think making it means you got a big paycheck. I mean, making it means you made some great music, and there's tons of that. I thought later era there were more bands that made great music that didn't make big money. But a band like the Laughing Hyenas, who should have been Nirvana, but they weren't because they had drug problems and so on, and people wouldn't touch them.
Right. And as you were putting the book together, was there a favorite era of music that you just didn't want to leave?
Well, early on, I thought I told. In fact, I think I said to maybe my editor, I said, "Man, I'll tell you what, you could write a whole book on the first era, Act One." Um, and maybe that's kind of a duh thing to say, but I didn't want to. I didn't think that would fairly represent Detroit because there's so much more. So but I did think that could have gone on for a while, and I have a lot of outtake material. Um, I don't know what to do with it.
Well,
I've talked to other people who've done these, and
yeah,
they said they had the same conundrum.
exactly. I'm sure.
Yeah,
Somehow got to get it out there. I know. Again, referring to Dick Wagner's book, which maybe turned into a movie at some point. I couldn't agree with you more. That early era of Detroit music is just so rich with history and information and.
Yeah, it was. It was, and I think probably because it's further in the rearview mirror, it makes it a little. It's. I don't know. I don't know. Is it safer to explore? I don't know. I don't know what that is, but there's more perspective is set in, and I think probably that latter '90s, early 2000s scene in Detroit will have the same impact. I think it'll be looked at in much the same way.
Hmm. Very cool. Well, I'm sure it's been fun getting out there too with the people of Detroit at book signings and.
Oh, sure, yeah, that's great because it's a great time for conversation, and you want to talk about it and so on. I think I'm a terrible salesman, so I'm not so interested when I go to these things. I'm not so interested in moving books as I am in hanging out and talking with these people. And people love to tell stories and that kind of stuff. So yes. It's a real pleasure for me.
Steve, it's been really fun to talk with you, and congratulations on the book because this is a really fun read, and Detroit is finally getting its due. I couldn't agree with you more. So.
Yeah, thanks so much.